Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I think we are just going to wait a little bit as people are entering the webinar, and we will start in a minute or two. Thank you. Right, good morning, everyone. I think we are ready to kick off on this webinar, Feeding the Future, how to use the Climate Change Act to ensure a just transition in the food system. So I want to start off by introducing myself. I am Penny Price from the Adaptation Network, where I am the coordinator. I will be your facilitator today. I'm pleased to see that there is a lot of you attending, which really speaks to the importance of this agenda. Just to give you a little bit of a background to the group in a way that is hosting this agenda, although thank you to the Institute for Economic Justice who have stepped in and been the lead organizer. But it is an expression of a broader group that has been working since 2023, where the policy dialogue process was started around adaptation and the just transition in the food system. And that really reflects a very broad cohort of civil society organizations who were involved in setting that up and have stayed as a working group, working together since that dialogue. So this webinar today is an expression of that group working towards that aim. To kick off, I think I need to take you through the agenda for the day. Yasira, if you don't mind sharing the agenda, just so I can give you an idea of how the webinar is going to be structured. We are busy with this introductory part now, which is my welcome and framing. Then we moving into a presentation by Yasira Mahdi from the Institute for Economic Justice. I will refer to them as IEJ from now on the food systems and climate in South Africa. So she's going to provide us with a bit of a background that we can kick off from. Then we're moving into Brandon Abdenor, who's going to be taking us through the Climate Change Act from a food system lens. We're then moving into the takeaways from some of our key constituencies, and these are people that have been key to this policy dialogue process that I referred to earlier. We will be hearing from Sizwe Tieso, from Naledi, from Ndavile Mokwena, from Gender CC, which stands for Gender Climate Change, and Lee Stadler from TCOE I can't remember what the acronym stands for. We'll ask her when we get to that point. Sorry about that. Then we're going to open the floor for some discussion. So we're going to hear from everyone and then open the floor for some discussion. Andrew's going to close the meeting by giving us a summary and looking at what comes next. So that's how we go. We're going to keep quite a tight timeline. I'm going to start off by cutting into my time and making sure that you all have sufficient time. So I'm not going to keep you for that much longer. I'm going to start by, where am I? Sorry, I'm navigating across my computer. I'm going to start by introducing the first speaker, who is Yassira Mahdi, as I said, from the IJ, where she's a junior climate policy and food systems researcher with a focus on rights-based, gender-responsive, and socially inclusive approaches to climate action. She holds an MSc in climate change and sustainable development from the University of Cape Town, where her research focused on climate adaptation strategies across African cities. Yassira, I'm going to hand over to you to give us the background. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Penny, and thank you for that introduction. Let me just share my presentation. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. But yeah, like Penny said, I'm going to be giving a short background on food systems and climate in South Africa, and what is the lens, and we'll just give a brief background to situate Brandon's presentation on the Climate Change Act. So yeah, diving right into it, in terms of South Africa's food system, it plays a dual role in the climate crisis, right? So it is both a source of emissions and it is vulnerable to its impact. In terms of being a source, it contributes nearly 23% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions, and is characterized by industrial production, energy-intensive processing, and corporate-controlled distributions. And as we can see from this graph on the right, the emissions stem from multiple sources, including methane from livestock, largely from cattle, nitrous oxide from synthetic fertilizers and energy-intensive processes of food processing, the refrigeration, packaging, transportation, and waste disposal. On the other hand, the food system is extremely vulnerable to the climate impact, and it's facing mounting climate threats, and rising temperatures, erratic rainfall, and prolonged droughts are already impacting the most vulnerable. The Southern African region is a climate change hotspot, and temperatures in South Africa could increase by 3.5 degrees Celsius over the next 40 years. Conditions will become drier in the western and northern parts of the country, but will get wetter in the eastern regions with more extreme rainfall. But overall, it means a decrease in water quality, a decrease in water availability, as rainfall becomes unpredictable and more erratic. And so what does that mean for the actual food system? In terms of the production, there's multiple implications. So, for example, climate change damages soil through extreme heat, erratic rainfall, and stronger winds, causing erosion, compaction, and loss of nutrients and organic matter. And this leads to poorer crop growth, poor yield, but also higher vulnerability to pests and diseases. In terms of the impact on crops, that rising temperatures and reduced water availability will put pressure on key crops. Staple crops like maize are especially sensitive to heat and rainfall changes, and this often results in reduced gross mass. And changing climates will shift planting and harvest seasons, creating unpredictability and increasing the risk of crop loss. This thus further threatening yield, but also intense rains can wash away seeds before they take root. So ultimately, crop loss or decreased yields are a major impact. When we look at livestock, Heat stress can reduce the quality and quantity of milk and meat produced by cows and sheep. It can also affect fertility. It can increase disease outbreak, and in extreme cases lead to death. And droughts limit water availability and reduce nutritious access. Reduce access to nutritious fodder, and this is especially impactful for small-scale farmers. And then in terms of fisheries, there's temperature variations in the ocean, and this shifts the distribution of fish. And this often forces fishes to travel further from shore and reduces the area where fish are available. And then also extreme weather can decrease the number of days suitable for fishing, affecting both income and food supply. So this is some brief ways in which the production level of the food system is impacted by the changing climate. But there's also wider impacts. There's impacts on the farm workers. So heat wave can lead to heat stress and heat stroke in workers, can also affect health and lead to a decrease in working hours. And then shifting weather patterns can change harvesting and planting time. And this can shift employment patterns, affecting seasonal workers and decreasing the amount of seasonal work available or making it more unpredictable and erratic. There's also an impact on smallholder farmers. So 90% of Southern African farms are rain-fed. Most smallholder farmers rely on rain. And as rain becomes more erratic, smallholder farmers are more exposed to climatic impact, and this ultimately decreases their resilience. And then the climate impact goes beyond just the production level and has impacts on many layers of the food systems. So, for example, from the retail end, informal food traders are particularly vulnerable to a changing climate. Firstly, because the impacts on production mean that informal traders have reduced access to produce and reduced access to quality produce. But also because informal traders typically use temporary infrastructure, they are more susceptible to destruction in extreme weather events. And all of these things mean that informal workers may have to work longer working hours to compensate for the precarity that this creates, but also that informal workers have a pressure to absorb rising food prices because typically they accommodate for low income people by having low food prices because of localized production and their temporary infrastructure. And so they typically have low food prices, and this is essential for them to compete with commercial enterprises, but this precarity jeopardizes this. And then there's an impact on household and workers. So there's a disruption to supply chains, which can lead to drastic increases in food prices. And this affects the most vulnerable, but also impacts food security and hunger, which is a huge issue in South Africa. So all these impacts in the food systems are situated within an already unequal food systems. So it's just amplifying impacts that are already there. So, for example, the food system is characterized already by land inequality. So most productive farmlands remain with a few white commercial farmers due to historical disposition and weak land reform. And millions of black smallholder farmers remain with insecure access to land and limited support to develop their livelihoods. And this land inequality pushed many onto marginal climate vulnerable land with poor infrastructure and limited support. And so lack of land ownership limits support that received when climate impacts hit, but in general lowers resilience as there's less agency to adapt. The food systems is also characterized by corporate dominance or monopolies. So a handful of big companies control everything from farm inputs to food retail, and they reap large profits while small-scale actors like informal traders are excluded from meaningful support and decision-making. And this is a problem, firstly, because the corporate model relies on energy-intensive production and industrial farming and reduces or crowds out diverse local production. but also that centralized long-distance supply chains are more exposed to climate disruptions like floods or droughts, especially when major production zones are hit. It has wide-ranging impacts for the entire food systems. And then South African food systems is already characterized by widespread hunger and food security across the country. But these things like decreased production, unstable supply chain, all lead to increasing food prices. And since hunger is an access issue that is prevented through these high food prices, climate change amplifies this. But also water prices and energy prices will increase, further impacting food insecurity and hunger in the country. There's also gendered care burdens. So there's disproportionate care burdens taken on by Black working class women who are expected to feed their families despite limited access to land and nutritious food and public support. And this is going to be amplified as climate increases the amount of care that women have to do as the support decreases. So yeah, there's essentially a major need to adapt to the crisis and to ensure that the food systems is resilient. But the question then is, what is the government policies that have been implemented to adhere to this crisis? And to give you a background of what has existed, there was the long-term adaptation scenarios, which anticipated climate events and tested different types of responses. There's the national determined contributions, which is mainly for mitigation in agriculture, but also the adaptation aspects in the food systems. But then the big one was the National Climate Adaptation Strategy, which is the national adaptation plan of the country, which mandated sector adaptation plans. And this is where the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Plan for Agriculture came about. So that's the specific adaptation plan for this topic area. And this was finalized in 2015. It was meant to be updated every 5 years, but did not happen. But now, as the Climate Change Act comes into play, we're looking at the next iteration of these types of policies. And so we can begin to set the agenda. But to look back and say, what did these climate policies say? The CCAMP, or the Sector Adaptation Plan, recognized the vulnerability of smallholder farmers, but sidelined them, focusing instead on upscaling and market integration, and sort of overlooking their potential to drive a just transition through agroecological resistance and sustainable food systems. But the NDCs and the National Adaptation Plan adopted a climate smart agricultural framework that was mainly focused on productivity and emissions reduction, but was really susceptible to be interpreted in a variety of ways that could embody a resilient or agroecological perspective, but really could be included in corporate greenwashing. And so these policies that have existed actually fail to adequately account for social and economic transformations central in certain ground-up frameworks like agroecology. And the main takeaway from all these policies is that they were really agricultural plans. They were focused on agriculture solely and not the entire food systems from production to retail to consumption. To waste, and they didn't focus on the array of actors within the food system. And there wasn't an incorporation of an integrated or holistic look at hunger or at labor or informal retailers, and really just focused on technical production level solutions. And so the question now is, what's next? What does the Climate Change Act process introduce? What is the policies that we can intercept, and how can we proactively set a progressive and inclusive agenda for the food systems? And what must be included in the upcoming policy. And so civil society has a chance to change this agenda and can push for maybe more than one technical production solutions on a holistic food systems approach, can push for sustainable farming practices like agroecology, push for more holistic support for smallholder farmers, for proper decent work agendas, and for economic measures for example, through regulating food prices. So we really have an opportunity here to set the agenda going forward. And as we go through this webinar, and as Brandon takes us through what the Climate Change Act mandates, we can really start to think what is the agenda that we want to set and how can we intercept these processes adequately. But yeah, I'll stop there and thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasira. That was an excellent introduction. I just want to remind you all to please put any questions you have in the Q&A. We have a Q&A. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen rather than in the chat. It makes it easier for me as the facilitator to pick up your questions and any comments that you might have. Also, thank you to all of those who are introducing yourselves in the chat. Please, if you haven't done so, do so. It's lovely to know who's in the room. The next speaker that I'm going to introduce is Brandon Abdenor, who is going to talk to us, take us through the Climate Change Act from a food systems perspective. Brandon is a senior climate advocacy lawyer at the Center for Environmental Rights. The acronym for that is CER. This is the world of acronyms. Brandon has been engaging on climate change issues since 2004 in various roles. He joined CER as a climate advocacy lawyer in 2021. In this role, he engages with climate change-related laws and policies with a view to helping ensure that those are effective and advance the needs of climate justice for all. The role includes liaising and working with a wide range of stakeholders to gather and share information and build consensus around legal advocacy in pursuit of an increasingly sound climate change response and just transition. Brandon, over to you. Thank you very much for presenting today.
Thanks, Penny, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. It's really good to be here. Good to see so many people engaging with this topic. And yeah, good to see that it's people from all corners of the country. And I think that just shows
Brandon,
yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt you because I see that we have a hand. I just want to ask if the hand is urgent or whether we can take it later. Tafadzwa. Great. Let's continue. Sorry, Brandon.
Thanks, Penny. No,
Over
all
to
good.
you.
Yeah, good to see that there's so many people here, and I think that just shows what an important topic this is. And thanks for that lead-in section, Yasira. I really enjoyed the way that it highlighted both the physical risks of climate change as well as the kind of structural injustice that is woven into all the different aspects. And yeah, these are the things that we need to address, and I will take us through the Climate Change Act and explore possibilities of where that might happen. So I'm just going to call up my presentation. All right, I hope everybody can see that. Yeah, as Penny said, I'm with the Center for Environmental Rights. We're a non-profit law organization registered as a law clinic focusing on environmental rights, environmental justice, and all of the intersectional issues that go along with that. And yeah, I'm going to take you through the Climate Change Act, a relatively new piece of legislation and a very, very important one. Just to give you a brief history, the sort of first pen to paper in a very formal sense was in 2011 with the National Climate Change Response White Paper. It seemed that a lot of work, or maybe not that much work, was happening in the background for some years, and then a version of the Climate Change Bill, the first version, was released for comment and consideration in 2018. Many stakeholders engaged with that, and then the bill sort of went underground again and spent a lot of time at NEDLAC, where I think much negotiating was happening, because when the next version came out in 2022, we saw some substantial changes, although the threads from the white paper were carried through in large part. And I'll speak a little bit more about what it may have happened in NEDLAC to unfortunately dilute the act or the bill in certain ways. And perhaps just to say that the bill or the act as it is now is not a silver bullet. Sometimes people are hoping that it's going to have a bunch of obligations that are going to whip different parties into line and ensure that the right things happen. It's very much a framework legislation. It is defined as a specific Environmental Management Act. So we have NEMA, or National Environment Management Act, which is the kind of predominant environmental management tool in legislation, which deals with general principles. So many of those general principles will apply to the Climate Change Act as well. And one of the things that those of us in the legal space need to do as we get more familiar and as events unfold is just understand exactly how we can use NEMA to strengthen the Climate Change Act. I think there are now 7 specific Environment Management Acts, including water, waste, biodiversity, conservation, and so on, with the Climate Change Act being the latest. The Act itself was promulgated in 2024, I think in July last year, so about a year ago. But it hadn't been proclaimed into law yet. And that happened in March 2025, or this year. But a number of provisions were deferred. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, I've got a few little icons, and where the hourglass is as I go through the presentation are where there are deferred provisions. And then there's another one that talks about where in the Act public participation is mandated. So the idea of the framework legislation is it really sets the skeleton, if you like, of what needs to happen. And then the idea is that regulations get made to put meat to that skeleton, if you like. And a lot of those are currently underway or in the process of being formulated. The deferred provisions are of concern. You will see that they predominantly refer to the tools in the Act around climate mitigation, how to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and perhaps even of more concern, climate adaptation. There are a number of mechanisms that get set into motion once they are proclaimed, and these have certain time periods. And those time periods don't start to run until those provisions are in fact operationalized. What we hear from the department and other decision makers is that they want to make sure that the regulations are in place and that some of the underlying mechanisms are further developed before they become operationalized. We also hear from various quarters that there is concern about lack of funding to operationalize some of these provisions, which is obviously of great concern. I don't want to be quoted as saying that is the reason, but certainly one hears that sort of thing, and it's not unusual. I think we're seeing that the money needed for many aspects of climate change response is not readily available. And certainly we're going to have a problem in this country if we can't put these mechanisms in place because of affordability. And that's going to have to spark us into thinking creatively around accessing that kind of money and making these things happen. So the Act is a relatively simple one and not particularly long. I think it's reasonably well drafted. The first sort of substantive chapter is chapter 2, and that talks about policy alignment and institutional arrangements to put this climate response machine in process. Chapter 3 speaks to the obligations and considerations for municipalities and provinces. So one of the things that this Act intends to do is kind of mainstream climate response across the breadth and the depth of the state at national, provincial, and local level, and across sectors. And Chapter 3 is one way that it, chapters 2 and 3 are in fact are ways that is achieved. Chapter 4 then deals with adaptation. Chapter 5 with mitigation, so removing greenhouse gas emissions, and then typical in any piece of legislation is Chapter 6, which is general matters and transitional arrangements, and that's where things like regulations come in and where public participation is stipulated. So going into the first element there, the policy alignment and institutional arrangements, kind of quite a small section tucked away, but actually a very powerful one, and I'll talk us through that. So firstly, it says that any legislation that specifically relates to climate change, if that competes or conflicts with the Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Act will prevail. So that is nice to see that it is kind of prioritized in terms of the hierarchy, but perhaps of more significance and impact is in Section 7, the Act speaks about alignment of policies. And what it says there is that every organ of state that exercises a power or function affected by climate change, and that will be all of them for those of us that understand the breadth of climate change, then there are not any, or certainly won't be many, that are not affected by climate change. Those organs of state must review, revise, amend, coordinate, and harmonize all their policies, laws, measures, programs, and decisions. And these must be harmonized with the objects and the principles of the Act. So there are no timeframes in there, there are no details on how this needs to be done. But basically, it's saying that all of these laws, policies, measures, programs, and very importantly, decisions need to line up with what the Climate Change Act is intending and prescribing. Why I say decisions is that's often where things fall between the cracks. So we work a lot in the energy space, given the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of it. And we now have the situation where the country's agreeing that there needs to be climate change response. There is an emissions reduction trajectory. We have NDCs. So certainly on paper, it seems that we're going in the right direction. And then you get these decisions such as the granting of environmental authorizations, which take the whole game in the opposite direction. So it doesn't help to have a greenhouse gas emissions reduction trajectory if we're going to have particular departments or decision makers continuing to approve the activities that lead to more greenhouse gas emissions or that stand in the way of adaptation and climate resilience. So I want to go through a few of the key principles and objectives. So when we start to challenge these different organs of state for not being in line, we are going to measure them against these objects and against these principles. And I think that's going to be a very interesting space over the next years. I mean, one certainly couldn't go to court and say, excuse me, Department of Agriculture has not aligned all of its laws, policies, measures, etc., with the Climate Change Act, because obviously these things take time. And there's a lot in the interpretation. You know, there'll be those that say that heavy industrial climate smart is the way to go. And then there are others that will say that agroecology and a far more sustainable approach to growing food is the way to go. And these things will come before a judge ultimately, if that's where it goes. And the judge needs to decide. I think as all of us that work in the climate space know, the other side, if you like, those who are maintaining business as usual have certainly got their stories very well thought through. They know how to rely on science to justify what they're saying. And these are the kinds of things that those of us pushing for strong climate response also need to be doing well. So some of the objects, and just looking at these perhaps through a food system lens to some degree anyway, the first one that I want to highlight is the object that says that the Act provides for a coordinated and integrated response by the economy and society to climate change and its impacts in accordance with the principles of cooperative governance. So this really speaks to the mainstreaming the need for all of the role players in the state and outside of the state for that matter, but in terms of governance, it's the state and the machinery of the state need to be working together to realize these objects, these principles, and to make these mechanisms work. A second one that I want to highlight, and I really do feel these are very well written in general, is that it must provide for the effective management of inevitable climate change impacts by enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change with a view to building social, economic, and environmental resilience and an adequate national adaptation response in the context of the global climate change response. So really highlighting adaptation and resilience, recognizing that the impacts are coming and that this act and other measures need to make sure that we as a society are prepared for it and able to withstand possibly increasing shocks to the climate system and all that goes with that. And then I just want to highlight some of the principles. So these objects and principles don't prescribe very clear and firm obligations. It's not the same as saying that X party will do A, B, and C, but it is a way of using the law to start bringing different parties into line. So some of the key principles, one of them is that the application of the act must be guided by the need for integrated management in the context of climate change, which requires climate change considerations to be integrated into the making of decisions that may have a significant effect on our ability to mitigate vulnerability to climate change. And another one is the need for decision making to consider the special needs and circumstances of localities and people that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, including vulnerable workers and groups such as women, especially poor and rural women, children, especially infants and child-headed families, the aged, the poor, the sick, and persons with disabilities. So there's a lot of inherent justice woven into this, and these are the tools that people from a public interest perspective can use. Just to maybe jump back and or zoom out for a moment. So this act predominantly, it binds all organs of state, and it's predominantly directing the state in terms of what the state needs to do. So there's a little bit which kind of exerts control over emitters of greenhouse gases, but it's certainly not an act that sort of allocates obligations to the general public, if you like. Which is something that can feel a bit frustrating, but if we think of what the intention of the act was, it is to make sure that the state mounts an effective climate response. Going a little bit further into the institutional arrangements now. So provinces and municipalities are very much roped in, which is obviously very important. And if we think that adaptation, I mean, there's a lot of it that's top down, and we'll get to that section. But a lot of it happens on the ground, if you like, within municipalities, within provinces. So to see them being given obligations is really gratifying and very important. So in the provinces, we already have existing what they call the Premier's Intergovernmental Forum. I personally can't speak to how effective those are or even know exactly what they look like, but that is prescribed in the Intergovernmental Relations Framework Act. And this forum now becomes the Provincial Forum on Climate Change as well. So that is possibly a good thing in some ways, and in some ways maybe not. The good thing from the perspective of it puts climate change officially on the agenda for the provinces and for this forum. So it can't be ignored. On the downside, as an agenda item that might be imposed on state officials that are not bringing a sort of understanding around climate change considerations, it might just be a tick box. So those that maybe work with these kinds of forums will know better, but what one can do from a public perspective, if you like, is make sure that the climate change response actions that are discussed and agreed to at those forums are following what needs to be done in terms of the act and in terms of sounds scientifically based climate change response. You'll see that the icon around public participation is applicable to this forum and to this coordination of the response. So technically, I guess there need to be opportunities for the public to engage. Again, I don't know what those forums look like, so this is an area that we will need to develop and become more familiar with. It also says that this provincial forum may establish a technical support structure. What exactly that looks like is not defined either, but I guess it's empowering them to bring in expertise and resources to be able to carry through those climate change response actions. The municipal forums is very similar. So this is district municipalities. So it's not every small municipality. It's the kind of larger umbrella ones. There's also an intergovernmental forum that's prescribed by that same act, and in the same way, it becomes the climate change forum. So again, there is a potential for public participation, and otherwise it's very much mirrors what the provincial forum is described as being, except that this district municipal one needs to report to the provincial one. So there's a lot of mechanics in place which can help ensure that things happen, but without sort of political will and the right sort of knowledge and understanding, these can also just become red tape, which eventually kind of fatigue the people involved and don't achieve the necessary outcomes. Another institutional arrangement set up by the Climate Change Act is the Presidential Climate Commission. I didn't mention at the beginning, I am a commissioner there since October last year. So the idea is that this is a forum where business, labor, civil society, and government sit to negotiate the social compact around a just transition, around the journey to decarbonization, and around climate resilience. So, the science is very clear in many cases on what needs to be done. But how that gets done in the context of an economy and a society and history and the global imbalance of power, et cetera, is not such a simple route. And this is the forum where the pathways to decarbonization and climate resilience and just transition are negotiated. It's potentially very powerful. It is an advisory body, so ultimately it can come up with recommendations that get completely ignored. And its political clout needs to be seen. I think it's been relatively successful so far. For example, we have Yasira mentioned the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. The last time we updated those in 2021, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment came out with a recommended NDC. The commission then went and commissioned a lot of research looking at what's doable, what's feasible, what's fair, and came back with a recommendation with a higher ambition for the NDC. And that was, in fact, then accepted by the department. So that was an example of early success. We're going to see a repeat of that process now with the NDCs being updated again. Just for information, we expect to see a draft NDC from the department by the end of July, and then there will be public participation for probably spread over the month of August, because this NDC needs to be finalized and submitted to the United Nations in September. So just an alert there that this is going to be an area that we can engage in, and we'll see how much the Commission's recommendation, which at this point in time looks quite strong, is in fact adopted then by the department and ultimately by Cabinet. The Commission has been very transparent with its Commission meetings being live streamed on Facebook. It holds many information seminars, it commissions many research reports, and it's really providing a layer of diving into climate change and just transition that hasn't existed in any other body in this way. And then continuing in terms of the mainstreaming, so this is where the sort of rubber starts meeting the road. Provinces and municipalities have got additional obligations, so they need to undertake climate change needs and response assessments, and then come up with a climate change response implementation plan based on that assessment. And these need to be revised every 5 years. So this is intended to analyze climate change needs and risks and identify and spatially map vulnerabilities based on the best available science. So this notion of best available science appears in a number of places in the Act, including in the principles, and it's reiterated here. So this is a very powerful tool, because we know that in the battle out there for business as usual versus a strong climate response, science is one of the footballs that gets kicked around, and you'll certainly get large emitters justifying continued emissions based on science. But, you know, that's cherry-picked. If we really look at the honest science of it, we know that we need to reduce emissions. So this is something that we keep on needing to lean into. The implementation plan must form part of an environmental implementation plan. So that's an existing obligation for the provinces, or the integrated development plans or IDPs by municipalities. And this is something that we are starting to work on already, in terms of engaging with eThekwini's integrated development plan, and just putting pressure on to make sure that climate change is adequately centered in the IDP, is realistically understood, and that measures are being put into place or at least contemplated adequately. Going now on to the next chapter around adaptation. So you can see the hourglass there. So this is one of the deferred provisions, and possibly for me anyway, one of the most disturbing ones. So what this says is the minister must determine, so 1 year after the Act comes into operation, and for all intents and purposes, it hasn't come into operation for this section, a national adaptation objectives and indicators for measuring progress. And then also a date for incorporation of objectives into all relevant planning instruments, policies, and programs. At the same time that these objectives are formulated, adaptation scenarios need to be formulated. So this is looking at what the impacts might be, or what the range of the impacts might be. I'm just thinking, if it were Richards Bay, for example, we're looking at what the risk of increased tropical cyclone activity would be, what it means for the port, what it means for the city there. And these scenarios need to be developed based, again, on best available science. And it must include systematic observation as well as early warning, consideration of potential impacts, and the responses to build adaptive capacity and resilience. So this is really mapping out what is it that is coming, and what is it that we need to do in order to be resilient to what is coming. So very sound in terms of the kind of structure of it, and making sure that you have your objectives and scenarios before you start coming up with your plans. So 2 years after the Act comes into operation, so a year after your scenarios and objectives, a national adaptation strategy and plan needs to be published by the minister, with the idea of achieving a reduction in vulnerability of economy, society, and environment, and enhancing adaptive capacity. It must also provide strategic and policy direction for adaptation, and an integrated and coordinated approach to adaptation management in all spheres of government. It also mentions there that where relevant, this process should include NGOs, private sectors, and communities. So just trying to bring the democracy in there, and unfortunately not very crisply articulated. So just how much the NGOs, private sector, and communities will be consulted remains to be seen. And this is a place that we need to continue pushing. A year after that national plan is published, Schedule 2 ministers, as they call them, and that's nearly all of the ministers of the different sectors, and obvious ones of being transport, agriculture, energy, human settlements, but really all of them, or nearly all of them, need to come up with their own sector plans. So what Yasera was talking about with the agriculture's plan from 2015, in a sense, you could say that department was preempting, and probably a very important department to do exactly that. I mean, all of this, in a sense, is late. You know, it would have been ideal to be here 15 years ago, but we're here now. At least we're not getting to it in 15 years from now. And then the risks and vulnerabilities related to climate change, again, need to be identified and spatially mapped. And I think that spatially mapped is very important. It brings a kind of a realness to it. We actually need to look at what happens in this region and this area and this town, so that we don't have this kind of cut and paste approach to adaptation. And then 2 years after the National Adaptation Plan is published, it must these sectors need to implement sector adaptation strategies and plans. So that's now 4 years after the adaptation chapter is operationalized. So again, good to see that some have been ahead of the game. But until there's an obligation with all of the sort of conditions and nuances, these different organs of state can't actually be held to account for not having one. So this is a concern, and one of the things that all of us in the climate space need to continue doing is pushing for the operationalization of these different tools and mechanisms. And those sector adaptation plans are also subject to public participation. So these are the places where we can really get stuck in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. From a mitigation perspective, so reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the minister needs to establish a greenhouse gas emissions trajectory in consultation with Cabinet. And currently our NDC that is sitting at the United Nations is our emissions trajectory. I can't see a situation where it would ever make sense where our NDC and our trajectory were not the same, but technically they could be in terms of the way the Act is worded. But I don't think we'll see that sort of level of divergence. I hope not. The NDC being a very important political signal to the globe, to including those involved in climate finance, but also sending a signal internally, so we can say that this is our government's stated ambition, and then hold people to account to that. Ultimately, it's a political decision what that NDC is, although I think they would run into trouble if they tried to depart too much from, again, the best available science. Then we have the sectoral emissions targets. So this is, if we consider that there's a certain amount of greenhouse gases that we can still emit to stay within whatever limit, a 1.5 degree, there's an actual quantifiable amount of what we can emit. And the idea of the sectoral emissions targets is, to some degree, is really divide up that remaining carbon space and say that different sectors are allowed to have different shares or portions of that carbon space. This is quite a political process in a way. I think we all know that the energy sector takes up most of that. Just that's the way it's evolved, and that the burning of fossil fuels for electricity simply is the most sort of carbon intensive activity of them all. But if we want to see change, we need to apply these sectoral emissions targets in a way that brings about that change. So it's not easy, it's not simple, and it's not cheap at all to decarbonize the electricity sector. But in a way, it's less complex than many of the others. The alternative technologies do exist in the form of renewable and storage. We know that the coal is incredibly carbon intensive and dirty in many other ways as well. So it seems to make sense that we should, have tighter sectoral emissions targets for something like the energy sector. And then there are other sectors that are far more complex. Transport. I mean, if we consider all of the vehicles on the roads and what needs to happen to make sure we have a working transportation system while phasing out internal combustion engines is not simple. And agriculture is another one that is not simple. So it seems to be fair and make sense to allow some of those sectors that are harder to mitigate a little bit more space. And this is one of the ongoing struggles that is in the political space around climate change. But tricky here, the minister, that being the Minister of the Environment, needs to set these sectoral emissions targets in consultation with responsible ministers. So that could create quite a competitive space. If we have a Minister of Electricity and Energy that insists on slower decarbonization, there's going to be a struggle there. And even in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports, they talk about this issue of how environment departments seem to have less political clout than something like energy, with the amounts of money involved and the sort of political capital there. So it's going to be interesting to see. My prediction is we're going to see that environmental ministries get more and more power as we have more impacts and as the general public starts to demand stronger action. But we're certainly not there at this point in time. Once those sectoral emissions targets have been set, then the responsible ministers must implement them via various policies, actions, and measures. That's within a year. So another place where we can hold certain portions of the state to account. Sorry. Right, what the minister also needs to do, and this is deferred as well, but also subject to public participation, is list the greenhouse gases. So, I mean, we really know what those are. Every now and again, a new synthetic one comes up, but we know that we predominantly dealing with carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These must be listed. And very importantly, the activities which cause or exacerbate climate change need to be doing it. So, in other words, combusting coal or clearing land in certain ways or whatever it may be. And that process leads to emissions thresholds, which identify persons subject to a carbon budget. So, yeah, despite the false shock and horror, there's going to be no carbon budgets at this point in time levied on ordinary people. We're talking about large emitters in the energy space, in the industrial space, in the agricultural space, whatever it may be, who get a carbon budget allocated to them. If they exceed that carbon budget, they will be subject to a higher carbon tax rate. Now, that is a form of incentive, certainly, or a form of deterrence, whichever way you look at it. But it's not the same as prohibiting the exceeding of a carbon budget. So when the bill came out in 2018, the exceedance of a carbon budget was in fact an offense. And not only could that punish emitters that failed to come in line, it would give the state the authority to prohibit that. That during this sort of NEDLAC process of 2 to 3 years was taken out. So I think that gives us an indication of what happens behind those doors. And it's no secret that the large emitters do not want to be forced to curb emissions. They make their commitments and their pledges in public. But I've heard one of the largest emitters, a representative from there, talk about the possibility of choosing to pay this higher carbon tax rate so as not to have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that is obviously very problematic. These people who have carbon budgets must submit the mitigation plans to the ministers, and it's an offense to fail to do so. The minister may make regulations in a number of spheres and must make them in others. I'm not going to go into those in too much detail now. And just to say that there are some offenses and penalties. So failure to provide information or providing false information or failing to submit a mitigation plan are all offences, but failing to adhere to the mitigation plan is not, which is the problem that I'm highlighting. The clauses around access to information are a little bit weak. So it says that any information provided to the minister must be made publicly available, subject to the Promotion of Access to Information Act and the Protection of Personal Information Act. Those acts both provide defenses to not provide information. So if this space is the same as the sort of air pollution space that we work in a lot and many other spaces, we're going to be having to push for information because a lot of this does not get made proactively available. So just to wrap up, actually acting on the Act, just based on the work that we've done, some recommendations would be really to use the science and develop the knowledge. At the end of the day, there's a lot out there in terms of how agroecology is a better response, the carbon sink potential of topsoil, the value of preserving and regenerating it, and many other aspects of the food system. So really just understanding, developing, commissioning reports if one has the resources to do so, or taking reports and then refining the narrative, telling the story, making it simple, making infographics, articles, whatever it is. Get the science out there, because the science is on the side of sound climate change response, and the food system has a lot of potential to do that. That will help build the support. 20 years ago, when I first got into the space, it felt like hardly anyone knew about climate change, and now it feels like many, many people are talking about it and engaging on it. So that support needs to continue to be built, and that helps move the political needle. The public participation opportunities are really important. This is where we can have our say and really understand, track what is going on when there are opportunities to engage, and then tell those stories of the engagement to the public more largely. And then using the law around this act and related acts. You know, sometimes all the advocacy in the world doesn't work and one has to go to court. But all levels of this kind of action are important and need to be followed. And then very finally, just when using the Climate Change Act around food system issues, also look at the Just Transition Framework. This is adopted by Cabinet. It's a broad umbrella policy, if you like. It's not, doesn't sort of prescribe great detail, but it sets out the principles, and this can be used in the advocacy and probably in litigation as well. And it speaks to distributive, procedural, and restorative justice, which are lenses of looking at all these various issues, and the issues raised in Yasira's presentation around the inequality, around hunger, around land injustice, around socioeconomic injustice in general. This lens of a just transition can be used to shift the needle on those things. So I think I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. I think we are all much more educated now about what is in the Climate Change Act and the opportunities for a bit of advocacy where we need to push and hold government to account. I think knowing the legislation is really, really useful. We don't all have the bandwidth or the inclination to read through all that stuff. So thank you very much, Brandon, for doing that for us and giving it to us in such a succinct form. We are now going over to the next stage of the webinar, which is to hear from some expert voices in the room, so some representing some of the key voices. And after that, as I pointed out earlier, we'll open the floor to all of you. So thank you to those two inputs, and we are now going to hear inputs from our key specialists. Let me introduce them to you. We have Melisizwe Tiso, who is a senior researcher at the National Labour and Economic Development Institute. Here's another acronym, NALEDI. So Tiso has over a decade of experience in the trade union movement. His work focuses on climate change and the just transition with key emitting sectors, where he's played a role in building the capacity of trade union officials across federations to engage effectively on climate change related issues. So that will be the voice representation from Labour speaking to us. The next speaker is Ndivile Mokoena, who is a co-director at Gender CC South Africa, Women for Climate Justice. Ndivile is currently working as the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Specialist there. Her work centers around policy advocacy on intersectional gender and social inclusion, running training and capacity building workshops for community organizations, civil society, women organizations, and underrepresented community groups. So that will bring in the voice of gender. Our last speaker in that panel is Lee Stadler, who is the Climate Justice Coordinator, and here is the name that I couldn't remember earlier, the Trust for Community Outreach and Education, so that's the TCOE. Her work spans research, educational materials, capacity development, and policy analysis. Lee's also affiliated to the African Climate and Development Initiative at UCT, where she works primarily on climate education, research, and capacity building. Capacity development projects. She's been there for the last 10 years. So Lee brings in that academic lens as well as the community empowerment lens. So without further ado, allow me to hand over to the first of you, who I believe is Meli Sizwe. Sizwe, as we call him. Thank you, Sizwe. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to Comrade Brandon, as well as Yasira for the presentations, as well as IEJ for organizing and allowing me giving me the platform to address this important webinar and topic. I think it's important for us as labor and civil society organizations, as well as community-based organizations, to remember that, the concept of a just transition is something that is a working class concept. And when I speak about the working class, I'm not speaking about those that are in informal employment only. But we are speaking about those that are also in informal employment, as well as those that do the unpaid labor or care work, as we like to refer to. So, I think just firstly, it's important for us to, always bear in mind that the just transition has justice as its central component, and that when we know and that climate change, the call for a just transition from the labor movement comes as far back as, especially in South Africa, as far back as 2011, when COSATU first recognized that, we have a crisis and we need to be acting and ensuring that we, as the working class, that all the talk about green jobs is not just another site for capitalist accumulation, which is what led us to the crisis of climate change that we have. So, climate change is already having impacts on health, on jobs, on food, water, and livelihoods, and is threatening the very survival of the working class people and communities. We've seen extreme weather conditions, droughts, floods, water scarcity, rising food prices, and new health risks, which have disproportionately affected the poor, women, and informal workers. For workers, especially those in carbon-intensive sectors such as your mining, energy, agriculture, and transport, a low carbon transition will bring significant economic restructuring, and this puts risks for job losses, decline in communities, socioeconomic standings, and a widening inequality if this is not managed justly. Historically, transitions have often sidelined workers, and this has resulted in job losses, broken communities, and deepening social crises. And a just transition means putting the needs and the rights of working people in the firm, in the planning, negotiation, and policy, which is something that COSATU has always advocated for. Now, without active participation of a strong labor voice, just transition policies risk being shaped by narrow business or technocratic interests, which will lead to greenwashing or shallow reforms that do not address the root injustices. We have now an opportunity to shape a fairer or more sustainable economy. A just transition can be a chance to win decent jobs, social protection, public investment, and democratic ownership in the new economy. And if organized labor and their affiliates need to mobilize effectively to ensure that partnerships between communities or civil society are strengthened. The new Climate Change Act also creates some binding obligations for government and opening opportunities for worker-driven proposals, stronger legal accountability in new advocacy spaces, especially regarding sectoral plans in sectors such as your energy, food, transport, as well as agriculture. I think, Brendan also mentioned that one of the things that the Climate Change Act does is it aims to align policies from various different government departments, which is something that we've often noted that there is a disconnect between government between government policies with the Department of Mineral Rights and Department of Mineral Rights and Energy pulling in one way, whilst the Department of Environmental Affairs is pulling in another direction. So we need to ensure that the implementation of the Climate Change Act, that we ensure that all the policies, such as your National Adaptation Plan and other sectoral adaptation plans, are legally required and open to public input. These are critical windows for labor and civil society to influence priorities and protections, as well as funding. We need to ensure that the consultation process is meaningful so that workers and communities' demands shape the outcomes and not just business interests. This is often the case where we find that consultation processes are tick box exercises, and the voices of communities and workers who are most affected are often sidelined. We need to make sure that we demand concrete plans, concrete plans in relation to, when we speak of the phasing out of fossil fuels or high emission sectors, we must make sure that there are robust and decent alternative jobs, retraining or reskilling, as well as income support or social or services such as the Universal Basic Income Grant, especially for workers and communities who are going to be most affected in this transition. Again, when we speak of public investments, when we need to make sure that we are fighting for public-led investment, not just private, in new industries, infrastructure, and services, including community ownership and participation. We need to ensure that social dialogue for binding structures at national, sectoral, and local levels. We need to be pushing for meaningful social dialogue. We need to make sure that we advance a food system just transition and go beyond commercial farming to include informal traders, smallholders, agroecological producers, and food workers. And we need to argue for adaptation plans that address food security or sovereignty, public health, land reform, and support for vulnerable workers. And then we all know that the agricultural sector has a bad reputation for decent jobs, with low wages, farm murders, trade workers in the farming space not represented by unions or being intimidated not to join trade unions. And I think the last I saw, the union density within the farming sector is less than 10%. We also need to just make sure that there's gender justice. The just transition must address the disproportionate risks and burdens on women and recognize care work and unpaid labor, as well as the impacts on communities. We need to mobilize for adequate, accessible, and equitable funding, including international climate finance, to support vulnerable workers and communities, and not the loans, concessional loans that we are currently seeing. We need to make sure that there is a.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you are running out of time. I'll give you another minute.
Okay, I'm nearly finished. All right, we need to ensure that we establish strong mechanisms to hold government and business accountable for commitments, and labor as well as civil society need to make sure that they play a monitoring and evaluation role. And then I think just as I round off, capacity building is very important to strengthen the ability of unions and communities to understand, organize, and intervene in these processes. And then lastly, we need to make sure that we push for a vision of a just transition that is about transforming society and promotes decent work, social equity, ecological sustainability, and not just managing the risks for business. Batubele. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sizwe, for that input. Next up, we have Ndivile. Ndivile, it will be useful to hear your takeaways from the presentations and your comments. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you to the previous presenters. I'm happy to note that our issues are aligned. We speak in one voice. So we work with marginalized and underrepresented groups, mostly women, youth, and smallholder farmers. And these are agents of change, albeit they are face of poverty and hunger. So the process of advancing a just food system transition is critical right now, especially that the food system is a missing ingredient from the South African Climate Change Act, as we heard from Brandon's presentation. The food system represents one of the most critical intersections of climate action, social and economic justice. The principles of food sovereignty must take root politically and socially. We need to improve food and nutrition security, resilient and diversified food systems to eradicate poverty that we are faced with. Women as custodians of food security typically shoulder the responsibility of providing healthy and sufficient food for their families and act as food security multipliers. Despite these vital contributions, they remain systematically disadvantaged by policies that are gender blind or gender biased. And this is an opportunity to center the crucial role that smallholder farmers, particularly women, play in driving climate adaptation through sustainable agriculture, nutritious and resilient food systems. In times of food insecurity, women and girls suffer the most. When hunger levels increase, so do levels of gender-based violence, particularly incidents of intimate partner violence and rape, child, early and forced marriages, sexual harassment, and sexual exploitation. This results in dysfunctional families and society. Sustainable food systems are needed to ensure appropriate food production and reduce losses and waste, while also safeguarding human and environmental health, integrity, political stability, and better livelihoods with less environmental consequences. So it is important that in our intervention and advocacy, we look at strengthening land rights for climate resilient agriculture, build networks and social movement that will hold the political space and can advocate collectively for enabling policy or against harmful laws. Food movements need to unite, working from bottom up, speaking with voices of farmers, women, and consumers. We need investments to be directed to effectively support low-income and resource-poor farmers. Investments that include climate finance to reach marginalized communities and contribute to long-term sustainability. We need to have sustainable food systems that are integrated in national climate plans, such as the NDCs, the NEPs, National Adaptation Plans, as Brandon has mentioned, and I think Sizwe has alluded to that as well, and also national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So it is important that we have food systems mainstreams in those important policies. And mainstreaming gender, well, the food system is quite key. Promoting seed sovereignty, traditional food systems, and right to food. Limit industrialization, artificialization, long and complex food systems. And we need to have traditional food system valorized, acknowledge the value of traditional African food systems and agroecology as the drivers of food transformation. Participation and inclusion that cannot be emphasized, not be less emphasized. I know Brandon and Sizwe touched on that, but it is important that we have participation, meaningful participation and inclusion of farmer organization and these underrepresented groups in decision-making processes. And lastly, I hope I kept to time, Penny. We need a holistic approach in addressing issues related to agriculture and food security, recognizing that adaptation is a priority for vulnerable groups, including women, indigenous people, and smallholder farmers. Thank you, Penny. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Ndivile, for bringing the voice of marginalized people to the fore, not just gender. So thank you very much for bringing that voice in. Lastly, we're going to Lee Studler. Lee from TCOE, as I explained. Lee, it will be good to hear your takeaways. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Penny. I'm motivated to stick to the 5 minutes because I see so many knowledge holders in the room, and I really want to hear from everyone else. So I'll run and stick to 5 points, 5 minutes, 5 points. And I think I'll also reiterate a lot of what Brandon, Sizwe, and Ndivile have already covered. But just the first point is really just around context and just making the point that there is no single story of a smallholder farmer. We have farmers, subsistence farmers, farmers for market, farmers as part of a diverse livelihood pool. Around 14% of South Africa is engaged in some form of agricultural activity across different geographies, different produce, different climates, different cultures, different land security, leased land, communal land, owned land, different water security. So it's this multiplicity makes policy engagement tricky. And where we do have agricultural focused policy, it tends to remain skewed towards commercial and export-oriented agriculture. It doesn't put emphasis on improving local food systems through market access, informal trade, and then those points around food sovereignty that Ndivile so eloquently cut now. And so it's already quite challenging to grapple with policies from the perspective of smallholder. They've just been so many lately. I mean, the National Comprehensive Producer Support and Development Strategy, the Plant Breeders' Rights Act. There's so many policies that need to be monitored, and so much risk of corporate lobbying undermining or watering down the provisions within those policies. So then taking that context into the Climate Change Act. So of course, agriculture is accounted for. It needs to develop a sectoral emissions target. It needs to develop a sectoral adaptation strategy and plan. So of course, working with those processes is a quite critical entry point within this process. But because of that multiplicity of context, there also are so many other state functions and national departments that are relevant, that have an impact on the lives of smallholder farmers. So not just agriculture, also fisheries, traditional affairs, economic development, rural development, land reform, water affairs, human settlements, trade, disaster risk reduction. So there really are a lot of entry points. And then, looking at the municipalities, the provincial municipalities, again, there's a risk from what we've seen already that our wealthier provinces, our wealthier metropoles develop and are able to implement more robust policies and strategies and plans, whereas our rural municipalities, it's often one person who's responsible for so much, and they themselves are overwhelmed. And so there's a real risk of a consultant coming, just writing that policy, not really opening up that space for engagement, or not really having a full, deep understanding of the small. A lot of argument around participation. There isn't really a clear institutional mechanism to ensure that participation. So there's no requirement to engage with smallholder farmers. And so it really is up to advocacy groups, grassroots organizations, NGOs, all of us to take that up and to build that into our work. And then in terms of actual advocacy points, so starting with mitigations and emissions, I think it's widely argued that the Act's approach to emissions reductions is very weak. And so that's one key advocacy point for us is to always bring it back to emissions. South Africa is normally within the top 15 emitters globally, which is significant, and smallholder farmers bear the brunt of those climate impacts. And so all of these emissions do come down and worsen the lives of smallholder farmers. So we need stronger mitigation commitments. But more than that, and in line with thinking around a just transition and a shift towards renewables, we also need to think about an energy commons, perhaps some kind of community energy policy strategy that can really help codify how the registration thresholds and local ownership percentages within IPPs and other renewable energy developments to really make sure that is reaching rural areas and that rural communities, including smallholder farmers, are benefiting from that energy transition. And then, I've gone over time. My last point is around, of course, the adaptation advocacy points, of course, access to market and always access to resources, being information, land, water, and of course, suitable financing. This act makes no focus on losses and damages or on loss and damage. And of course, there are limits of adaptation, especially with smallholder farmers with limited resources in areas that are highly vulnerable to extreme climate hazards. And so we need to also be advocating around the development of these various financial mechanisms that come with the Climate Change Act, like the Climate Response Fund, the Municipal Disaster Recovery Fund. How can we ensure that these instruments are suitable and accessible to smallholder farmers? And then, of course, making our early warning systems more robust, strengthening our extension services, and just all-round capacity development, both amongst farmers and then amongst the government officials, to be able to not only work with these policies and acts, but actually implement them. I think we have such strong legislation in South Africa, but often the implementation of it falls short. So as we get into discussion, I'm really welcome other insights from the room. And just to note, my colleague Robert Andrews is in the room if he wants to chip in and add to what I've missed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. I think we've had some fantastic inputs this morning to really set us up for a good discussion. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A, but before we go there, I think I'm going to give an opportunity for anyone who's got any burning questions just to raise a hand. If there's no immediate hands, then we'll start dealing with the Q&A. There's some really excellent points that have been made there. Anyone want to make any inputs at this point? No? Right.
Sorry,
Let's
Penny,
go through the
I do see
Yes.
4 people with hands up.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know
Thank
if
you
you can't
very
see it your
much.
side.
I can't see it my side. Let me change.
Should I?
Let me change my view. I can't.
Would you like me to
Right.
call them out in the meantime?
Yes, please, if you could. I'm not seeing
Okay.
them.
I see Chere Monesa, then Clement Mopuli, then Israel Nkosi, and then Busisiwe Kankela. So, Chere?
Cheddar, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me
Okay,
now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate this. I'm at TIPS, the Trade Industrial Policy Strategy Organization, and I'm with specifically the department I'm in is Just Transition and Labor Center.
Mm-hmm.
And I really enjoyed the presentations. Particularly, personally, my interest is that about the food security. You know, because are we going through an energy transition, or are we going through a just transition? So that's one of my questions and interests, that are we going through a just transition which is about energy, or are we going about a just transition which is about human beings? And I like this. I definitely wanted to be part of this because talking about food and hunger is one of the core elements of that. So, but I think,
Thank you.
yes, I think I'll
Oh,
leave it as an
sorry.
open question, because it does feel like that is like, are we just going through an energy transition, or transition, and then how do we make sure that it is a just transition? I think
Thank
I'll
you very
stop there for
much.
now.
Thank you very much, Chere, for bringing that perspective in. I think that's a key question, although the just transition is not just about energy. So it did start off in the energy space, but it certainly speaks to transitioning away from fossil fuels. So in that regard, it is around energy, but there is the whole climate change arena around that transition away from fossil fuels. So that includes adaptation and everything else as well. So thank you, but I think it's good to put these topics on the table. The next one, I'm not sure of the order that you read them out in, but the next one I see is Dr. Janet. Go ahead, Janet.
Greetings, everyone. Sorry, I was struggling to locate the audio, the mic. Anyway, thank you so much, Chair, and to our very candid presenters, panelists. Thank you so much for such very enlightening presentations. I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, it's too short for us to have all those robust debates, but I'm really super grateful. So I just want to have a quick one, just to address all the presenters, just a generic one. For example, we are busy working around through Oxfam South Africa and Oxfam Kenya, and our colleagues in India. We are trying to put together some key policy recommendations to the G20 through the C20 process. I've had so many engaging and interesting diverse points from all the speakers, from a gendered lens, the key demands from the working class. For example, I think we totally agree to the idea of the financing part of it, that it shouldn't be concessional loans, but it should be reparations. I think that we have to speak strongly and boldly around that from wherever angle we are. I understand there are so many community voices and representatives perspectives in this particular webinar and elsewhere across Africa. So my key question to everyone who has presented is, what would be your top priority, top key recommendations that you might want to be included in our policy recommendations from a civil society perspective? I know there are diverse issues, the working class, the social grants issues as raised by Comrade Sizwe, but we do have to come to perhaps consolidate at least one key priority from your presentation. Sorry about that, but thank you so much. I would be very happy to hear, so that as we are also developing our policy briefs, we also incorporate this very profound inputs from this particular space. Thank you so much. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Janet. Before you go, would you just introduce yourself quickly so we know where you're speaking from? And this goes to all the other speakers. Thank you.
I always forget to introduce myself. I assume I'm a celebrity. Okay, I'm Janet Mnakamwe, a Pan-African feminist scholar, senior lecturer and researcher at Wits University. In my old days, I used to work at Naledi together with Comrade Sizwe, and also a labor specialist. Currently, I've been deployed as one of the key partners working closely with Oxfam South Africa to the C20 process. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Janet. The next hand I've got up is Clement. Clement, if you could also just give a brief introduction so we know where you're coming from. Thank you. Over to you.
Am I audible enough?
You are audible. Hi, you're audible. Go ahead, Clement.
Oh, okay. Okay, my name is Clement Mwepudi. I'm from the environmental group called Grassroots for Climate Action. I'm based in Gauteng, and also I'm a horticulture expert, and also I'm a environmental activist on the grassroots level, and also I'm an ambassador for the Disability Society. Anyway, for me, thanks for the opportunity, Chair. Thanks for the nice presentation, mixing the Climate Change Act with the Just Transition. Mostly, I just want to comment on Brendan's presentation about the application, and also the Act binds all states of organs, because we know we have our National Environmental Management Act, because it have to align with the NEMA Act. And also the other thing is that the PCC, as on the Climate Change Act, it have to be listed as a public entity under Schedule 3 to the Public Finance Management Act. And it must be a national entity for process of the Public Management Act, because which means the commissioners have to get salary from the PCC. They have to be a structure itself. And also the function of the PCC can be implemented due to the intervention of the TFFE, because the TFFE also itself, it's using the PCC's advantage for advising them and coming with them. Like now the NTC, we don't know the plan of the NTC of the TFFE, because it's a mother body for the environment. And also we need to be strict about the involvement of decision making. We know public participation is, to participate, but you must be consulted, and you have to put your input, like the decisions. Other decisions is not clear that the civil society, because I'm presenting the civil society, have to be included in the decision making, because I can see that the function of the PCC is to advise on the climate change response, but the people who are appointed, they say they must be qualified. So how can you qualify it on the climate change, which affects everyone? Because even on the civil society, there are people who qualified, but who don't have documents that they are qualified. They know, as Brendan said, evidence. It's a scientific evidence that the response and the risks that's happening to the grassroots level is happening. And we need also the implementation of the fund, the climate change response fund. Since it was happening, it's almost 1 year now. 26 July, the act will have 1 year, but no action. It's just the talk. We must not walk the talk. We must make sure that things are implemented, and we need time frame. Thanks for that. We understand that we have to come low on these other industries like the agriculture and the transport, but it must come on speed, because if we relax, then also we are in danger for the climate change risk and hazard. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Clement, for bringing that grassroots voice into the discussion. I think you raised some key points. We'll see if we've got time for feedback on some of those. My one observation is that in terms of public participation, and this goes to all of you, is it's the public participation processes are inadequate. And I would suggest that you follow the cue of the work that has been done in eThekwini recently, where civil society organizations actually caucused amongst themselves to provide input into the IDP. And I would suggest that all of you start looking around for ways to caucus amongst yourselves with your peer groups and your constituencies of your organizations to actually make sure that you are ready for those inputs and to give inputs beyond when they are invited. So we cannot wait for these public participation processes that really, someone said in the Q&A, they go to the large centers, which makes sense given the fiscal restraints that we're currently operating under as a country. And there will be a 1 day, at most a 2-day event. So it's really inadequate to hear the voices that are coming from the ground. So that would be my suggestion to you. On to Busisiwe, Mganpela, Mamchawe, take the floor.
Yeah, good day, everyone. I'm not even going to introduce myself for time. I've written a lot of things in the question and answer, but then I just wanted, in case then we don't come to that, I just wanted to say I'm grateful for the work that is being done by civil society on the just transition and in the food systems. And very much also grateful for today's presentations. But my plea is on the multi-stakeholders that are in this space to say that agroecology farmers, I'm just talking about agroecology amongst the food systems that were mentioned. Agroecology farmers are there on the ground, they are practicing. They are a source of the proof of what we are talking about in the Climate Act and in the climate justice. It can then be a lot of support parallel to the support on the policy and advocacy, support the farmers on the ground that are doing this thing that we want policies for, so that then the proof of pudding is in the eating. So that then we can see that what we are talking about is really something that can be done and it is possible. And amongst that, with the frustration that the agroecology farmers are having on the ground, it also goes with the frustrations of the extension officers on the ground, that is from the Department of Agriculture, because you'll find that mostly these webinars are attended by the top management, leaving the very people that are working with the farmers that are in loggerheads with farmers because of the differences they are having in information, because extension officers don't know about these systems. They don't know about agroecology. They want to help, but then there are also challenges that the programs of the department are putting, these very same programs that I've put as examples. So I am pleading and really with the funders, the people that make proposals, multi-stakeholders, civil society, to not alienate these agroecology farmers that are doing so well, so that then there's proof. And lastly, could there be also practical adaptation measures that are happening, because the climate change catastrophes are happening now. There's drought, there's floods, there's heat, but then nothing is happening on the ground to assist those farmers that are so passionate about this, the earth and the food systems and just transition and everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Busisiwe. We have one more hand, and then I'm going to ask Andrew to close. I think we've done quite well in answering quite a lot of the questions in the Q&A. If there's any burning questions that you'd like to discuss further, then please just make contact with the I&J team and we can answer those. We can look at answering those directly. Vinola, I see that you have a hand up. If you could please just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you for chairing the session, Penny. Yes, I would like to ask for the speakers. We are heading for the G20 and we are heading for all these international global processes on climate justice and food security. But I think that we know all the time that the powers that be, they come and co-opt our concepts. You know, they will talk about just energy transition in the same way as they would have spoken about poverty eradication in the past became poverty alleviation, and so all our concepts are diluted. I think the same is happening now with just energy transition and just agriculture transition. And I think that it is going to depend on how strong we are organized on the ground. So I want to ask the speaker, given the fact that we still organize in all these fragmented processes, for example, food is this side, climate that side, gender-based violence that side, the women are that side, and the rural people are that side. How can we make sure that we build a united intersectional movement on climate change and just energy transition, food security, in order to really address this and in order to show some muscle at the G20? Otherwise, we will just be voices shouting from the fringes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vanola, for that call to action, as it were, call for collectiveness. What we have seen on the landscape is quite a lot of alliances and coalitions, which I think speak to your point about people organizing themselves into larger groupings. So I think you're making that call that there actually needs to be more of that and across and more broadly. So good point. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew Benny from IJ to close for us. Before I do, I just want to respond to one of the questions in the Q&A, which was around the broader food system, and is there any way of using technology to assist with the aggregation of small-scale farmer produce. And I just wanted to say that there is an interesting example on the South African landscape where that has been done very successfully. There's a number of examples, but there's one that really stands out, and that's the work that's been done in the small-scale fisher area. And if you Google Abalobi, so ABALOBI, you will see how they've used technology. They've created a whole app which has many uses. So that's an interesting thing to look at. I think it's an interesting example for those of you who are small-scale farmers and looking at how to aggregate together to be able to compete with large-scale industrial agriculture. Andrew, thank you very much. I would like to, before I hand over to you, just to, from my side, thank everyone who's attended. We've had great attendance today. And thank you very much to the speakers who gave of their time. Thank you very much, Andrew. Over to you to do a summary. Maybe if you wish to, you can touch on some of the questions in the Q&A, but just for you to point us to the way forward from this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Penny, and thanks everyone who has been here and contributed. Maybe quickly before I wrap up, and through you, Chair Penny, could I just check if any of the speakers want to have any last words? Perhaps if there are urgent points that were raised by some of the audience's important inputs, and then I can take that into a way forward as well, just in case any of the speakers has last words.
Thank you. We've got Brandon and Sizwe. Brandon, your hand was up first.
Thank you. I'll just be very quick. Just two items I did want to address. The one is the chair's point about energy transition and just transition. Yeah, the just transition needs to happen at every level so that this journey to a climate resilient society and economy leaves no one behind, and in fact undoes the inequalities of the past. The current economic system is not compatible with sound climate response. The energy transition is the most urgent thing that needs to be done. But yes, in a way, it's been co-opted and hijacked, and now it's about global north companies putting big tech in, et cetera, et cetera. But let that not cause us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to work at all of these levels in all of these sectors to ensure that justice is woven into this movement. And then just quickly, Lindsay's question, clarity and linkages between the Act, Just Transition and NDC process. So the Act gives direction and strategic guidance and sometimes specific measures to organs of state predominantly on how they need to implement climate change response. The just transition is a more broad concept. So we have a just transition framework, which is effectively a policy, but it's very umbrella. But in there's a lot of treasure that we can work with. And then the NDC is our global commitment in terms of the Paris Agreement to have the target. So they speak to each other, but they all have their own separate things. The PCC is called for inputs on its draft, but the department, we're expecting a call for input at the end of July or very early August. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Brandon. Over to Sizwe.
Thank you very much, Comrade Penny. I just wanted to read something from the COSATU policy framework of 2011, and I think it will address both Chera's question as well as Janet's question. It says there, a just transition is a transformative and economy-wide process based on social dialogue, social protection, protection of workers' rights, and importantly, job retention and creation. A just transition is not possible without addressing the key social challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment in South Africa. So, Chera, in terms of your question, it should be an economy-wide process, considering that our economy has been based on the the minerals and energy complex, and these have been identified as some of the key emitting sectors within the South African context. And you're quite right. We should be addressing an economy-wide transition, and not merely an energy transition. And then lastly, to Comrade Janet, I think, one of the biggest priorities is meaningful consultation. The consultation processes that we currently have feel very tick box, and the voices of communities and workers are not adequately heard in the consultation processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. No other responses from any of the speakers that I can see. So that is over to you, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, thanks again, everyone, for the really rich discussions, to the audience, to Penny for chairing, your excellent chairing, and to the speakers for the really useful and important information. Just a few points to wrap up with. I think just one quick reflection is, I think one of the things that's really come out of the discussion is the need for us to continue developing and advancing a transformative vision of the food system when we engage with the implementation of the Act, and when we work to influence the content of its implementation. around those various aspects that Brandon took us through, the key points for us to potentially intervene, both in the kind of official processes themselves, but also in our outside advocacy, if you will. I think an important point, speaking to Venola's point. I see, for example, Richard, your comment in the Q&A about the disjoint between agricultural policy and imperatives for food security with climate resilience. I think that's one of the exact reasons why we need to be advancing a whole food systems vision in how we push for the implementation of the Act. That includes thinking about strengthening resilience of local and national food system, questioning the high emphasis on exports at the moment. If we don't do that, I think the main focus will be on for adaptation, for example, will be on protecting the commercial sector in order to protect exports. And we need to be talking about a completely different food system that's oriented towards just transition around sustainability and resilience, equitable livelihoods and decent work, and one that meets the right to food and nutrition, especially under climate change. I think also just, and that also means there's another comment in the chat there about these new exclusions that the Department of Social Development and SASSA are trying to introduce around grants. And one of them, I see the point there about if grant recipients have income from smallholder farming activities, for example, that can exclude them. And I think that's one of the kind of very important things and perspectives we need to be taking into this Act, is that what we propose in terms of resilience and a just transition isn't just about, agricultural production is a very important part of it, but we need to be pointing to social policy, to economic policy as also critical in a just transition and in building resilience. So, for example, social grants provide one source of investment, for example, to smallholder farmers to invest in their farming, and so further bolster their household food security and resilience. So the two should be seen together. We can't be situating them in contradiction with each other. And this is one example, I think, a really good example of what it means to take a food systems approach, that we're also making proposals potentially around social policy in our inputs on the Climate Change Act, for example. So just on the question of Q&A, so I see there were a lot of further inputs in the Q&A. So please, we'll try and we'll obviously save the Q&A, the chat, and the recording of this webinar, and take these points on board. Yasira has also shared my email addresses. So if any of these concerns want to be taken up further with us, as Penny mentioned, we're part of a loose coalition that's working on this, and I think so getting involved further, providing further information is really important in terms of continuing to act collaboratively and broadening our collaboration in influencing the implementation of the Act around a progressive food system agenda. So we will share the presentations afterwards. There'll also, the recording of this webinar, after some slight editing, will be uploaded to YouTube. So the recording of it will also be available. Also to say, we're using background research as well as vigorous notes taken during this webinar to produce a short fact sheet around the topic of this webinar. So it's also something I saw a lot of questions and comments around the need for materials to take to your constituencies to further do further awareness raising and popular education work. So we'll be developing a short fact sheet for that purpose further. And then yeah, on I think one of the key questions that I'm also taking from this webinar is the question of participation, and its centrality to this kept coming up. So I think there's also work for us as a network to further support increased participation in the process around the Climate Change Act, but also building up participation, our own spaces of participation to influence various aspects of the implementation of the Act, like the example Penny used about civil society caucusing in the eThekwini IDP. And so lastly, we're holding this capacity building workshop as part of a longer process to support the engagement of increased connection between different constituencies, back to your point, Vanola. and engagement in climate policy and food systems. So we're having a more intensive capacity building workshop in early October with different constituencies to further support participation and influence in the Climate Change Act and climate policy. And some key activities there will include creating our own spaces of participation, but also strengthening the capacity of constituencies to participate in that. So I think it's important for us to develop, as the point Brandon raised about speaking to wider society and supporting wider engagement, developing tools that help raise further awareness and capacity about these processes under the Climate Change Act, and the capacity of communities and constituencies to increase their participation to really push a people's agenda in these processes. And so developing these tools, I think, is going to be really important for the coalition, for all of us in this virtual room. But also, if you would like to get hold of us further, as I said, our email addresses are in the chat to discuss further ideas and needs for particular tools to help enhance and increase participation by ordinary people and constituencies, then please do get in touch. I think that's it from my side, Penny, and everyone. So thank you to everyone for being here. Should I close or should I hand back to you, Penny?
I'm happy to close. So just
Great.
again, we've gone a little bit over time, but thank you very much. We managed to fit a lot in and keep time quite well. So thank you everyone for that. And as Andrew said, I think there are some exciting developments coming up. So please stay tuned. Get hold of myself as well at the Adaptation Network. You can find us on the internet. If you want to just be part of our mailing list, and we can loop you into these kind of things in future. So we are also doing some work on policy engagement. We have a small project that we're working. Some of you are in the room. And yeah, we look forward to taking the space forward. Thank you again for your attendance and time. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you and
Thank
good
you.
day. to
Goodbye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Penny and everyone. Bye.